Cops mock the black woman on trial, completely unaware she's the director of the Bureau for National Civil Security. A charged silence swept through the courtroom as the defendant, a composed black woman, stepped forward. At the prosecution's table, two smug police officers exchanged cocky glances, certain they were moments away from crushing her, from publicly humiliating her, for daring to defy their authority. But what they didn't know would shatter their confidence. She was no ordinary defendant. The balance of power was about to flip in a way no one saw coming, swift, brutal, and unforgettable. Prejudice, buried secrets, and the weight of long overdue justice hung thick in the air. What began as a simple case was about to erupt into the most explosive trial the city had ever witnessed. A reckoning years in the making, and no one in that courtroom would leave untouched. The wind rolled low and thick across Portfield's east side that morning, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Willow Glen was a quiet, respectable neighborhood, the kind with creaking porch swings, fresh mulch in the flower beds, and retirees who still read the morning paper on their stoops. But beneath its orderly surface ran something more sinister, and on that particular morning it finally bubbled to the top. It began without warning. A black SUV pulled into the curb beside a modest single-story home, a well-kept brick house with a faded lawn sign that read, "Neighborhood Watch is watching you." The SUV door opened, and out stepped a woman in dark slacks and a crisp, high-collared blouse the color of midnight. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled into a coiled braid, her posture flawless. She walked with the precise confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms where others whisper. Her name was Raven Sinclair, but no one in the neighborhood knew that. Not yet. As she approached the home, a commotion was already underway. 3 squad cars were parked at odd angles on the street, lights off, but presence loud. Officers stood in the front yard, some pretending to examine documents, others simply posturing. Wide stances, arms crossed, thumbs hooked on utility belts. 2 of them, Officer Ryan Caldwell and Officer Ethan Brooks, were already known in Portfield's more vulnerable neighborhoods, known not for service, but for intimidation. Raven clocked them immediately. The predatory alertness in Caldwell's eyes, the twitch of adrenaline in Brooks' jaw. She'd seen men like them before. She'd dismantled men like them before. She said nothing at first, merely observing. Something felt off. The police presence was too heavy, the energy too performative for a simple investigation. The house being swarmed belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, a 74-year-old widow who had filed 2 civil complaints in the past year against Portfield PD. Raven had visited her last month, off the record, and now this, a random house check. Raven crossed the street and called out, calmly, respectfully, asking what was going on. Caldwell turned, lips already curling into a smirk. Brooks followed, scanning her face, then her clothes, calculating. "Ma'am," Caldwell said, voice laced with condescension, "this is an active investigation. You need to back away unless you want to get involved." Raven showed no reaction, only held her ground. "I have questions about the nature of this operation. This resident has raised concerns about prior harassment. Who approved this warrant?" The smirk vanished from Caldwell's mouth. "Who are you again?" Raven opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. "Not yet. Not here. Let them underestimate her. Let them play their hand." "I'm a concerned visitor," she said simply, "and I know the law well enough to know this looks excessive." Brooks chuckled. "Concerned visitor? This your street? No? Then walk, or I swear you'll be leaving in cuffs." She didn't flinch. That seemed to infuriate them both. The exchange was captured by a teenager on his phone from across the street. The boy had only started recording when the confrontation escalated, when Caldwell abruptly stepped forward and grabbed Raven's arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced force. Brooks moved in close, barking orders at no one in particular, as if conjuring an audience would justify the arrest. "Obstructing a police operation," he snapped. "She refused lawful orders. Get the cuffs." "She didn't do anything," someone yelled from a porch. "She was just talking." But the officers didn't pause. The cuffs snapped closed behind Raven's back with mechanical finality, the clink of metal echoing too loudly in the quiet neighborhood. In that moment, something passed between Raven and the crowd gathering at the edge of their yards. She looked up, not with panic, not with anger, but with a deliberate, icy calm. She scanned the street like a chess master reading the board mid-game. Her jaw was tight, her eyes like polished obsidian. She wasn't afraid. She was taking notes. And as Brooks shoved her toward the squad car, the boy across the street caught a close-up of her face. That image, a black woman in a navy blouse, hands bound, gaze steady, was posted online within minutes. No one in Portfield had heard the name Raven Sinclair in months. Her appointment hadn't made local headlines. Most in the courtroom that would soon try her case wouldn't recognize her, certainly not the smug officers who thought they'd just taught some arrogant troublemaker a lesson. But as the video spread first through neighborhood group chats, then city forums, then national feeds, questions erupted like wildfire. Who was she? Why was she arrested? And why did she look like she knew exactly what was about to happen? The storm had touched down. The city just didn't know it yet. The following Monday, the Portfield courthouse loomed like a relic of some old self-righteous empire, columns too tall, flags too stiff in the wind, and a security presence that felt more like a performance than protection. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the low thrum of journalists setting up tripods, lawyers adjusting ties, and citizens whispering behind folded newspapers. The air was thick with anticipation. No one could quite put their finger on why this particular case, the state of Illinois versus Raven Sinclair, felt different. The official charge was obstruction of a police investigation, the kind of offense that typically saw a quiet plea deal or a shrug from the press. But something about this woman, her composure, her silence, her refusal to issue any public statement, had cracked open the city's curiosity like a crowbar prying into rusted steel. Courtroom 3A filled to capacity within minutes. At the defense table sat Raven Sinclair, hands folded on the polished wood, dressed in a steel gray suit that matched the storm gathering outside. She looked serene, untouched by the noise around her. But her eyes were those of someone playing a long game, watchful, strategic, patient. Flanking her was Adrian Calloway, a defense attorney whose very presence was a signal that this case would be anything but ordinary. A legend in civil rights law, Adrian had spent the better part of 3 decades waging legal war against corrupt municipalities and crooked prosecutors. He didn't take cases for show, he took them to make someone bleed. Across the aisle, the prosecution exuded a different energy. Clara Hastings, assistant district attorney and rising star in Portfield's political circles, stood flanked by officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks, the 2 men who had arrested Raven in the now infamous video. Clara was sharp, stylish, and politically savvy. She'd made her name being tough but fair, and her ambition had teeth. Her posture was perfect, but beneath her polished veneer, her eyes flicked back to Raven too often, as though trying to peel away her calm to see what lay beneath. Caldwell and Brooks, for their part, carried themselves like men convinced the system was their shield. Caldwell wore a tailored suit over his broad frame, looking every inch the confident veteran officer, while Brooks sat tighter, more nervous, bouncing one knee as if still buzzing from the adrenaline of the arrest. They exchanged a few low, smug remarks before the session began, chuckling under their breath like schoolyard bullies, convinced they'd already won. Then the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Judge Helena Carter entered, robes sweeping behind her like shadows on marble. Known for her stern demeanor and intolerance for courtroom theatrics, she surveyed the room like a hawk. Her gavel hit the block with a sharp crack. "Let's proceed!" The opening statements began. Clara Hastings stood first, pacing slowly before the jury, a diverse group of 12 Portfield residents, most of them stone-faced, uncertain, still blinking off the morning fog. Clara's tone was crisp and confident. She painted Raven as a disruptive force, a woman who inserted herself recklessly into an ongoing police operation, endangering officers and undermining justice. Her voice was carefully modulated, professional, but laced with a patronizing undertone. Every time she said Ms. Sinclair, it came with the faintest curl of condescension, as though Raven were an unruly child who needed correcting. Caldwell and Brooks nodded solemnly at her words, trying to appear like dutiful civil servants who had simply followed protocol. But the atmosphere shifted when Adrian Calloway rose. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he approached the jury like a father telling a hard truth to his children. "What you're going to hear over the next few days will disturb you," he said, his voice a low thrum of conviction. Not because Ms. Sinclair is guilty, but because the officers seated across this room acted as if no one would ever hold them accountable. His eyes passed briefly over Caldwell and Brooks. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell forced a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Adrian continued, hinting at manipulated reports, missing footage, and a troubling history of misconduct buried beneath stacks of redacted files. He didn't reveal too much, not yet, but his closing remark landed like thunder. And when you learn who Ms. Sinclair really is, you'll understand why they were so eager to silence her. The room seemed to inhale as one. Judge Carter called for a recess. As people filed out into the hallway, the murmurs began. Who is she really? What are they hiding? And sitting silently at the defense table, Raven Sinclair simply smiled, just slightly, as if the match she'd struck had finally caught flame. By the time the jury reconvened after recess, the gallery was twice as crowded and 10 times more restless. Word had begun to ripple beyond the courtroom walls. Something about this woman, this Raven Sinclair, wasn't adding up. Not in the way the prosecution told it. She didn't flinch when accused. She didn't plead for mercy. She didn't look like someone running from accountability. She looked like someone marching toward it. And with every second that ticked by, more eyes were turning to her not as the defendant, but as the mystery at the heart of a very public reckoning. Adrian Calloway stood, once the judge resumed proceedings, calm and deliberate, like a man flipping over the first card in a long, carefully stacked deck. Your Honor, the defense calls Nina Delgado to the stand. Heads turned as a woman in her late 60s walked forward, her frame small but her presence striking. Nina's gray curls were pulled back, and she wore a maroon blazer pinned with a neighborhood watch badge. Her gait was slow but dignified. She was not a stranger to this courtroom. Years ago, she'd testified in a zoning case that helped prevent a corrupt housing development from bulldozing her block. People respected her, some feared her. And as she took the oath, her eyes never left the officers at the prosecution table. Nina, Adrian began gently, were you present on the day Raven Sinclair was arrested? Yes, she said, voice steady. I was walking my dog, Milo. We take the same route every morning. And what did you see? Nina's eyes narrowed slightly, as though pulling the memory into sharp focus. I saw 3 squad cars and a lot of noise for a street where nothing ever happens. Officers were moving around the yard like they were performing for someone. Then Ms. Sinclair approached them, calm, respectful, asking what was going on. She didn't raise her voice. She wasn't aggressive. She was firm, but never hostile. Adrian nodded, then gestured toward the jury. What happened next? Nina's expression darkened. One of the officers, the younger one, Brooks, I think, started barking orders. The older one, Caldwell, called her something under his breath. I won't repeat it, but it wasn't professional. Then suddenly they grabbed her, no warning, no reason. It was like they wanted to make an example of her. A hush fell over the room. Clara Hastings rose for cross-examination, her heels echoing like metronomes of precision. Ms. Delgado, you said you were across the street. How far exactly? 30 feet? 40? Maybe 35, Nina said coolly. So you wouldn't have heard every word exchanged between Ms. Sinclair and the officers, correct? Nina tilted her head. I heard enough, and I saw everything. Clara pressed on. And forgive me, but your eyesight at that distance. Do you wear glasses? For reading, Nina snapped. Not for seeing police mistreat someone in broad daylight. A ripple of laughter flickered through the gallery. Clara's lips tightened. Have you been active in local activism, Ms. Delgado? She asked, voice now laced with strategic skepticism. I've stood up when something smells wrong. If that's activism, then yes. She turned to the jury. And this? This reeks. Clara returned to her seat, offering no further questions. She knew better than to try and outmaneuver a witness who just won the room with a single phrase. As Nina stepped down, Adrian stood again. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present surveillance footage from a home camera down the street. Judge Carter nodded. The lights dimmed, and on the screen above the jury, grainy black and white footage flickered to life. There was Raven, standing across the street, arms by her side, speaking, her body language calm, composed. Then, without any sign of escalation, Brooks stepped forward, hand on cuffs. Caldwell flanked her. She backed away slightly, holding out her palms. Then, in one sudden movement, they grabbed her and slammed her against the car. No sound, just pure motion. When the footage paused on Raven's restrained form, the gallery sat frozen. This, Adrian said, is what the officers called obstruction. He turned slowly to the jury. No yelling, no pushing, no crime. Just questions, and violence in return. Caldwell shifted in his seat. Brooks looked pale. Judge Carter leaned forward, her normally impassive face tight with thought. The mask was slipping now, not just from the officer's narrative, but from the entire system's face. A woman had been arrested for daring to ask why, and now the jury was seeing exactly what that defiance cost her. Raven said nothing, but as the lights came back on and the prosecution scrambled to regroup, her silence spoke volumes. She was still waiting, watching, and they hadn't even begun to feel the storm she was about to unleash. The storm brewing inside the courtroom began to seep into the corridors of City Hall and the streets beyond. After the footage and Nina Delgado's damning testimony, murmurs of doubt whispered louder in Portfield's public forums, editorial pages, and local newsrooms. Social media exploded with speculation and fury. Who was Raven Sinclair? Why had officers Caldwell and Brooks reacted so violently? And why did their story seem thinner with each passing witness? As the city teetered on the edge of a civic reckoning inside the courtroom, the case was shifting from a straightforward defense into a high-stakes psychological duel, a battle not just of facts, but of perception, memory, and motive. Adrian Calloway sensed it. He stood at the defense table reviewing his notes while the jury filed back into their box, eyes sharper now, less neutral. They were watching everyone with quiet intensity. Even Judge Helena Carter, so carefully restrained in her demeanor, had begun to lean forward more often, her eyes flicking toward the prosecution with subtle scrutiny. Adrian rose. The defense calls Dr. Alana Pierce to the stand. All eyes turned as a poised black woman in her early 50s walked confidently to the witness box. Dr. Pierce, a forensic psychologist renowned for her work in racial trauma and police-civilian dynamics, was no stranger to controversial cases. Her presence signaled a new phase of the trial, one that would crack open not just the incident, but the mindset behind it. Dr. Pierce, Adrian began, can you help the jury understand how repeated exposure to law enforcement harassment affects the psychology of those targeted? She nodded, folding her hands. Certainly. What I've observed in my 2 decades of research is that individuals, especially those from historically marginalized communities, develop a form of hypervigilance. It's a survival mechanism. When someone like Mrs. Sinclair sees a cluster of police surrounding a home in her neighborhood, especially knowing that the resident is elderly and vulnerable, her instinct isn't confrontation, it's concern. But to officers operating within a system that often dehumanizes those same communities, that concern can be misread, or worse, weaponized. A murmur passed through the gallery. Adrian let the words hang. And in your expert opinion, he continued, did the footage we reviewed earlier suggest any behavior from Ms. Sinclair that could be interpreted as hostile? No, Dr. Pierce said firmly. She displayed classic signs of regulation. Open palms, calm gestures, a lowered voice. She was trying to de-escalate. And how would an officer, one already conditioned to view certain bodies as threatening, interpret those gestures? If that officer carries implicit or explicit bias, Pierce answered, they might interpret even peaceful behavior as defiance, especially if the civilian is black and questioning authority. Clara Hastings objected, but too late. The words had landed. During cross-examination, Clara attempted to poke holes. Doctor? Pierce, you weren't there. You didn't hear the tone of voice. Couldn't her body language have shifted before or after the footage? Pierce remained steady. The footage is clear. The officers escalated, not Ms. Sinclair. Clara's jaw tensed as she returned to her seat, her arguments beginning to fray. The next move came swiftly. Adrian called for Officer Ryan Caldwell to take the stand. The defense had secured his testimony under subpoena. The courtroom held its collective breath as the veteran officer approached, his confident stride a little less certain than the day before. Under direct examination from Clara, Caldwell reiterated his version of events. Ms. Sinclair was obstructive, aggressive, and threatened to make calls that would bring down hell on them. He spoke with rehearsed authority, but his eyes darted too much, searching the jury, the judge, and finally resting uneasily on Raven. Then Adrian stepped forward. Officer Caldwell, he began, his tone measured but laced with steel, you claim Ms. Sinclair made threats. Are those threats recorded on your body cam? A pause. There was an issue with the cam that day, Adrian raised an eyebrow. A malfunction? Caldwell nodded. Yes. And Officer Brooks's cam? Same issue. So you're asking this jury to believe that both your body cams failed at the exact moment Ms. Sinclair allegedly threatened you? Caldwell bristled. It's happened before. These things aren't perfect. Adrian walked to the evidence monitor. Let's consult department maintenance logs. According to these, both devices were tested and approved less than 24 hours before the arrest. No reports of malfunction. Silence. Adrian leaned closer. Officer Caldwell, isn't it true that this isn't the first time your body comm has failed during a civilian complaint? Objection. Overruled. Caldwell squirmed. I don't recall. No? Adrian held up a copy of an internal affairs complaint. One from a black teen detained last year under suspicious circumstances. The footage? Lost. The officer? Caldwell. The courtroom was ice cold now, every juror leaning in. Caldwell's facade was cracking, sweat now gathering at his brow. He stole a glance at Brooks, whose face had gone ghostly. And still, Raven Sinclair had not said a word. She sat quietly, her eyes steady, watching the prosecution's mask slide inch by inch off its face. The chessboard was set. The next move would be devastating. By the time the fifth day of testimony dawned, the courthouse had become a pressure cooker of whispers, headlines, and building outrage. What had begun as a small-town trial for a minor obstruction charge now pulsed through the veins of national discourse. Satellite trucks lined the curb outside the Portfield courthouse, their long antennae pointed skyward like metallic trees seeking a signal from the gods. Inside, the energy had changed. No longer a detached legal proceeding. This had become something else, something bigger. People were no longer watching to see if Raven Sinclair was innocent. They were watching to see how far the rot went. When Adrian Calloway entered the courtroom that morning, he was flanked by Raven and her assistant Maya, both solemn but composed. Raven wore a deep forest green suit, understated yet sharp, her eyes focused and unreadable. She hadn't spoken publicly, hadn't given a single interview or statement. But her silence had only deepened the intrigue. The public had begun to refer to her online as the woman they underestimated, and now they were waiting to see how long that underestimation would hold. Today's strategy was about leverage. Adrian knew the officers' stories were unraveling, but now it was time to apply pressure in a new way, by shaking the prosecution's foundation with the unexpected appearance of allies no one expected. As the crowd settled and the judge banged her gavel, Adrian stood and called his next witness, Reverend Elijah Hawthorne. A quiet hush fell over the gallery as the tall, silver-haired minister stepped up to the stand. Elijah was no ordinary preacher. He was a civil rights icon in the region, his presence at community protests and city hall hearings stretching back 3 decades. When he took the oath, the weight of history seemed to echo through his voice. Reverend Hawthorne, Adrian began, can you describe your relationship to the events that led to Ms. Sinclair's arrest? I wasn't there that day, the Reverend replied, but I've known Raven Sinclair long before Portfield ever did. And I know the pattern that runs through this courtroom. Different uniforms, same sickness. He then spoke of countless complaints made against officers Caldwell and Brooks, complaints from young men, single mothers, elderly residents, people who lacked the power or status to challenge authority. His words were not angry, they were grieved. What happened to Ms. Sinclair is not new, he said. The only thing new is that someone finally had the standing to make it undeniable. Adrian let the Reverend's words hang in the air before nodding to Maya, who opened the doors at the back of the gallery. In walked Vanessa Holloway, and the room gasped. Once a staunch conservative columnist and vocal law and order advocate, Vanessa had been known to defend the Portfield Police Department without hesitation. But last year her teenage son had been stopped and frisked by officers without cause, and when she'd filed a complaint, she received nothing but silence. She had kept quiet publicly, until now. Under oath, Vanessa told the jury, I spent years believing the system worked because it worked for me, until it didn't. And when I saw Ms. Sinclair arrested, I saw my son. I saw every mother who never got an apology. The gallery was frozen. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed shaken. Clara Hastings looked rattled, flipping through her notes as if a strategy might suddenly materialize. Behind her, officers Caldwell and Brooks sat stiffly, their earlier swagger now fossilized into something brittle and afraid. But Adrian wasn't finished. He called to the stand Sergeant Javier Dominguez, a 20-year veteran of the Portfield PD, known for being quiet, reliable, and until now completely silent about his department's inner workings. Dominguez, called under subpoena, looked nervous but determined. He testified that he had arrived at the scene minutes after Raven's arrest and found her in cuffs, shaken but composed. More damningly, he confirmed that both Caldwell and Brooks' body cams were inexplicably powered off, violating clear departmental protocol. Then came the crack in the wall. "I filed 2 internal reports against Officer Caldwell in the past 5 years," Dominguez said, voice low but clear. Both were quietly dismissed. One involved excessive force. The other, racially charged language during a traffic stop. The gallery erupted. Judge Carter called for silence, banging her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. On the prosecution's bench, Clara's face was pale. She tried to regain control with a tense cross-examination, accusing Dominguez of holding a personal grudge, but his answers were calm, unwavering. "This isn't about a grudge. It's about truth." As Dominguez stepped down, Adrian turned briefly toward Raven, who met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The tide had turned. The court no longer saw Raven as a defendant. It saw her as a fault line, one that had cracked wide open the illusion of law without prejudice. And now, no one knew how far the quake would reach. The tension inside the courtroom had grown into something living, tangible, thick and heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, every subtle breath from the jury carried weight. People were no longer here just for the trial. They were here for the unraveling. The once confident facade of Officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks had begun to show cracks, hairline fractures that widened with each day. The courtroom gallery, once polite and reserved, now held a mixture of hushed defiance and cautious hope. Every morning, the line outside the courthouse grew longer. The people of Portfield weren't just watching this case anymore. They were waiting for justice to wake up. Adrian Calloway stepped into the courtroom that morning with the expression of a man holding a blade behind his back. He'd seen the games prosecutors played. He'd seen how systems protected themselves, how misplaced files and missing footage had a habit of smothering truth before it could speak. But not this time. Not with Raven Sinclair sitting beside him, composed, watchful, a living reminder that power could be graceful and furious all at once. Her silence up until now wasn't weakness. It was calculation. She was waiting for the moment when her truth would strike like thunder. The gallery stirred when the first unexpected figure entered. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, tall and solemn in a dark overcoat, his presence as commanding as any official in the room. A lifelong civil rights advocate and the spiritual cornerstone of Portfield's black community, his arrival sent a message louder than any protest chant. The people were watching, and the people remembered. Following him was Vanessa Holloway, a former conservative commentator whose scathing editorials once praised the Portfield PD as pillars of order. But all of that changed the day her teenage son was wrongfully stopped and searched by Officer Caldwell. That day shattered her beliefs. And now, she too was here, her presence carrying the weight of penance and conviction. As the judge gavelled in the session, Adrian rose. "Your Honor, the defense calls Reverend Elijah Hawthorne." Whispers rippled through the gallery as the Reverend stepped to the stand, raising his right hand with the gravitas of a man preparing to testify not just for the court, but for history. His voice was calm but powerful, each word landing with precision. "I've been in Portfield for 40 years, he said. "I've buried sons who shouldn't have died, and I've sat with mothers who asked why the badge never apologized. Today, I sit here because this city has a chance to do more than mourn. It has a chance to correct." He spoke of Raven Sinclair not just as a defendant, but as a woman of principle, someone he'd crossed paths with years before when she was quietly investigating discriminatory policing policies across the state. He described a pattern of abuse from certain officers like Caldwell and Brooks, whose behavior had been tolerated for too long. Their uniform were used not to protect but to intimidate. Next, Vanessa Holloway took the stand. Her testimony was quieter, more personal. She described the fear in her son's eyes, the indignity of knowing her wealth and status couldn't shield her family from prejudice. "I used to write about law and order like it was sacred," she said, voice trembling. "But a order without justice is just control." The courtroom was silent. Clara Hastings shifted in her seat, her once unshakable confidence now dulled into caution. She tried to object, to pivot, to distract, but each objection landed with less conviction than the last. Every effort to redirect the narrative now felt more like deflection, and then Adrian dropped the hammer. "The defense calls Sergeant Javier Dominguez." The gallery gasped. Dominguez had served on the force for over 2 decades, respected, quiet, not known for choosing sides. But here he was, summoned under subpoena. His expression haunted and reluctant. Under Adrian's questioning, he admitted what few officers ever did, that he had witnessed questionable behavior by Caldwell and Brooks firsthand. He recalled internal reports he had filed, reports that disappeared. He admitted that he had grown afraid, not of criminals, but of his own department's silence. "I saw Ms. Sinclair in cuffs that day," Dominguez said. "She wasn't resisting, she wasn't threatening, she was asking questions. That's not a crime." When Clara cross-examined, she accused Dominguez of harboring resentment, of using this trial to settle scores. But he didn't budge. "The truth doesn't need a grudge," he replied. "It just needs to be told." As he stepped down, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The foundation beneath the prosecution's case had been rattled again. And Raven? She didn't speak, didn't move. But something had shifted in her gaze, something colder, sharper. The storm was no longer on its way. It had arrived. And the question now wasn't whether the courtroom could withstand it. It was whether Portfield itself could. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, the air humming with electricity. Rumors had been swirling since the previous afternoon. Something big was coming. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras silently clicking at intervals. Jurors sat stiff-backed, wide-eyed, their expressions betraying anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed more alert than usual, her fingers twitching slightly at the edge of her bench. Outside, the line of people trying to enter the courthouse wrapped around the block. And at the heart of it all sat Raven Sinclair, silent, composed, perfectly still, like the eye of the storm she herself had summoned. Adrian Calloway stood beside her, his voice calm, but with a current of restrained power. "Your Honor, the defense would now like to call Ms. Raven Sinclair to the stand." A ripple passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The jury turned to watch her rise. She moved slowly, deliberately, the heels of her shoes echoing across the floor with each step toward the witness chair. Maya, seated in the gallery, glanced up from her notes with a flicker of nervous pride. This was the moment they'd been building toward, not just a defense, but a revelation. Raven took the oath with quiet confidence, her right hand raised, her voice firm and unwavering. Once seated, Adrian approached with the reverence of a man standing on the edge of history. "Miss Sinclair," he began, "please tell the court about your background." Raven's gaze swept the courtroom, not defiantly, but purposefully. "I was born in Charleston, South Carolina," she said, her voice smooth and low. "My father was a Baptist minister and my mother a public school principal. I learned early what it meant to live under the weight of both expectation and injustice." She went on to explain her education, degrees in political science and criminal justice, her work in the FBI, her years spent specializing in civil rights investigations, and counterterrorism. Each detail added another layer to the figure once perceived as nothing more than a civilian interloper. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the image of a woman handcuffed on a sidewalk with the credentials now being recited with chilling clarity. Adrian took a slow breath before delivering the final question. "And what is your current role, Ms. Sinclair?" Raven didn't hesitate. "I am the director of the National Civil Security Bureau, under the Department of Homeland Security. I was appointed 4 months ago by presidential order." The silence shattered. The gallery erupted into gasps, reporters scribbled furiously, and even a few jurors' mouths fell open. Judge Carter slammed her gavel once, then twice. "Order! Order in the court!" But the order had already been broken. At the prosecution table, Clara Hastings froze mid-note, her face a mask of disbelief. Caldwell paled visibly, his eyes darting around the room, while Brooks sank into his chair like a man watching the tide rise around his neck. Adrian let the chaos settle before he turned back to Raven. And on the day of your arrest, what was your reason for being on Alder Street? I was conducting an unannounced independent audit of civil rights compliance and local police activity, she said. The house under surveillance belonged to a woman I had met during prior outreach. I approached the officers out of concern for excessive force. I never raised my voice. I never interfered with their operation. I only asked questions. And were you arrested without cause? Yes, she said flatly. Because they saw a black woman asking questions. That was all the cause they needed. The courtroom fell into a breathless silence again, not out of disbelief, but out of recognition. What had once seemed like an ambiguous case now stood fully exposed. Raven hadn't just been wrongly arrested, she'd been silenced by a system that never thought to ask who she truly was. Her final words before stepping down struck with poetic finality. I didn't come here to pull rank. I came here to remind you that power without accountability is just oppression dressed in uniform. And with that, she returned to her seat, while the courtroom reeled from the weight of truth dropped like a hammer in its midst. The tide had not only turned, it had thundered ashore. The revelation of Raven Sinclair's identity had detonated through the courtroom like a slow-moving explosion, every word of her testimony still echoing in the stunned silence that followed. But as the jury and the public reeled, Adrian Calloway was already moving into the final, most dangerous phase of his strategy, total exposure. Now that Raven's truth had shattered the prosecution's illusion, it was time to finish peeling back the layers of deception surrounding the Westbridge Police Department and its chosen defenders. The day's proceedings began not with a whisper, but with a collision, between the story the officers had carefully crafted and the damning facts waiting in the wings. Adrian stepped before the jury with a new level of intensity in his tone. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to call a rebuttal witness, Officer Devin Marks. There was a stir in the gallery. No one had heard the name before, but Clara Hastings looked up sharply, her spine straightening. She recognized it, and she knew what was coming. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a young man in uniform entered, nervous and pale. Officer Marks was slight, with anxious eyes and the stiff posture of someone who'd spent days weighing whether to speak or to disappear. He approached the witness stand like a soldier crossing a minefield, glancing once toward the prosecution's table, then quickly away. Once sworn in, Adrian approached carefully. Officer Marks, you work in the Westbridge PD Digital Evidence Unit, correct? Yes, Marks replied, his voice thin but steady. I handle technical review and storage of body cam and surveillance footage. And were you on duty the day of Ms. Sinclair's arrest? I was. Adrian's next question came like a knife. Did you receive any requests concerning the body cam footage from that day? A pause, a swallow, then, yes. I was asked to modify the logs. The room inhaled as one. Adrian stepped closer. What do you mean by modify? Marks hesitated, his face pale. Lieutenant Avery instructed me to backdate a malfunction report for both Officer Caldwell's and Officer Brooks's body cams. He said it was just a paperwork correction, but it wasn't. The footage was there, at first. And what happened to it? I was told to delete it, not just move it, erase it. He said the case was minor and the optics were bad. Did Officers Caldwell and Brooks know about this? Marks looked down. Yes. They were CC'd in the request, and Officer Brooks followed up with me personally, told me to clean the mess so it didn't come back on them. The gallery exploded into whispers. Judge Carter hammered her gavel again and again, but the room had turned electric. Clara Hastings looked like a woman cornered. She quickly stood demanding that Officer Marks be held in contempt for violating departmental confidentiality. Adrian countered immediately. The people have a right to know when justice is manipulated from the inside. Judge Carter allowed the testimony to stand. The tide was now irreversible. Then came the final blow. Adrian displayed a newly admitted exhibit, a string of internal emails, recovered through Raven's federal clearance, showing a months-long pattern of Caldwell and Brooks routinely deleting footage or filing malfunctions, most of them following incidents involving minority civilians. Dozens of them. And in nearly every case, Internal Affairs had ruled the complaints inconclusive, due to lack of available evidence. There was no recovering from it. The prosecution sat frozen. Clara stared blankly at the screen as her star witnesses unraveled before her eyes. Brooks looked ashen, his foot tapping under the table like he was ready to bolt. Caldwell clenched his jaw so tight the muscles twitched. The courtroom had become a crucible. Every illusion of integrity surrounding the officers had melted away, leaving behind only the raw, uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about Raven anymore. This was about everyone they had silenced, every neighborhood they had terrorized, every complaint that had vanished without a trace. And at the center of it all, Raven sat silent once again, watching the scales tip. But this time, it wasn't just her life hanging in the balance. It was the entire system. And the whole world was finally watching. By the 9th day, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a battlefield of truth. The grandeur of the judge's bench, the polished sheen of the marble floors, the hum of murmuring spectators, it all seemed thin, barely able to contain the seismic tension crackling beneath. The once smug prosecution was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Clara Hastings, once poised and calculating, now looked like a gambler watching her last chip slide across the table. Officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks sat like shadows of themselves, their posture rigid, their expressions cracked with anxiety. They had arrived here with the armor of uniforms and the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. That armor was now shattered, replaced by sweat-slicked brows, darting eyes, and silence that spoke louder than any of their past bravado. And Raven Sinclair, she remained still, calm, almost unsettlingly so. She sat with her hands folded not as a victim seeking redemption, but as a sentinel watching the fire she had lit spread to every corner of the courtroom. Her truth had been laid bare, her credentials confirmed, and the false narrative the officers had so confidently spun was now ash beneath the relentless weight of testimony, footage, and damning internal documents. But Raven knew the collapse wasn't complete. Not yet. Adrian Calloway stood with a quiet authority that had only grown more commanding with each passing day. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Helena Carter, "the defense would like to recall Officer Ethan Brooks to the stand for additional testimony." Brooks's head jerked toward his attorney, whose whispered objections fell flat against the inevitability of the moment. Reluctantly, Brooks stood, his hands twitching slightly as he returned to the witness box. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by tight lips, reddened cheeks, and the posture of a man backed into a corner. Adrian approached slowly, almost gently. "Officer Brooks, you testified last week that Ms. Sinclair verbally threatened you and Officer Caldwell. You said she attempted to interfere with an active police investigation, correct?" "Yes," Brooks said, barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded. "We've since heard testimony from 3 eyewitnesses, 2 digital forensic experts, a psychologist, and Sergeant Javier Dominguez, all of whom dispute your account. We've seen video footage contradicting your timeline. We've reviewed internal complaints that place your credibility in question. So, let me ask again, under oath, did Ms. Sinclair threaten you?" A beat. Brooks stared at the floor. The silence stretched long enough for the gallery to begin leaning forward in unison. "No," he finally muttered. "Not exactly." "What did she say?" "She asked questions," he admitted. "About the warrant, about our procedure." "And was that a threat, Officer Brooks?" "No." Adrian nodded slowly. "Thank you. One more question. Why did you follow up with Officer Marks about the footage?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want things to get out of hand. She was a federal officer and I panicked." "So you knew who she was?" "Not at first," Brooks said quickly. "But when I found out later, I was scared. We knew it was bad." "Scared of accountability?" Adrian asked. Brooks didn't answer. The courtroom murmured again, louder this time. Adrian turned toward Judge Carter. The defense rests its case. It was like the final tile falling in a chain reaction. Clara Hastings stood only to say she had no more witnesses, her voice thin and dry. She didn't bother with a passionate closing, only a procedural one, delivered like a formality she no longer believed in. The illusion of certainty she had projected throughout the trial had disintegrated. She looked defeated, and perhaps deep down, ashamed. That night, news outlets ran the footage from inside the courtroom, splicing Brooks' reluctant confession with Raven's testimony and expert analysis. Clips went viral, people calling her the woman who unmasked the lie, the silence breaker, the reckoning in a navy suit. Hashtags lit up. Number Justice for Raven, number Portfield Reckoning, number Truth in Uniform. Inside the courtroom the next day, Caldwell asked to address the court. His voice shook as he offered a public apology, stammered, incomplete but real. Brooks followed, his face pale, admitting they had let fear and bias guide their actions. Raven listened quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't even flinch. When asked if she had anything to say in response, she stood and said, "Acknowledgement is not absolution, but it is a start." And just like that, the final breath of their lie was exhaled. The mask had fallen. And the city of Portfield was now staring at the truth it could no longer ignore. The 10th day arrived with a strange stillness, as if the city of Portfield was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the energy was taut and electric, the kind of tension that clings to skin and makes the air feel heavier than it should. Reporters were shoulder to shoulder, their equipment humming with anticipation. Protesters and supporters of Raven Sinclair filled the steps outside, holding signs, hands clasped, faces turned toward the courthouse windows like they might catch a glimpse of history happening inside. The jury had been deliberating for less than a day, but already the collective sense was that the truth had long since spoken. All that remained was for the law to acknowledge it. Raven sat motionless at the defense table, flanked by Adrian Calloway and Maya, her ever-steady assistant. Her hands were folded, her eyes forward, expression unreadable. The calm she radiated wasn't complacency, it was resolve. She had faced the weight of the system and stood her ground. She had exposed the machinery behind the badges, laid bare the rot that had festered behind sealed records and official reports. But now even she could feel the tremble in the air, as if something ancient and deeply rooted was about to be judged. The courtroom door opened. "All rise," the bailiff called. The jury filed in, every face a mask of solemn gravity. Not a whisper stirred. Judge Helena Carter's voice was steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her tightly wound hair and a backbone of steel in her posture, rose with a folded slip in her hand. She handed it to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. A beat of silence passed as Judge Carter read the verdict. Then her voice rang out across the courtroom. "On the charge of false arrest, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of filing falsified police reports, guilty." The air exploded. Gasps, shouts, tears, applause stifled by the sharp banging of Judge Carter's gavel. But no amount of wood against wood could erase the sound of vindication echoing through that chamber. Caldwell sat with his head bowed, his fists clenched tight against the arms of his chair. Beside him, Brooks looked as though his skeleton had been hollowed out, all the swagger of earlier days drained away, replaced by the heavy silence of reckoning. Clara Hastings closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last breath of a truth she had tried not to see. For her, this trial had started as a career move, a quick conviction wrapped in the optics of order. But now she looked like a woman who'd stood too close to the fire and realized, too late, it was justice burning through the lies. Judge Carter's voice, steady, but not without feeling, continued. "Given the gravity of the charges and the compelling evidence of systemic misconduct, sentencing will be scheduled for next month. In the meantime, Officers Caldwell and Brooks are remanded to federal custody under electronic monitoring. Their employment with the Portfield Police Department is terminated effective immediately." The officers were led out not with defiance, but with the quiet submission of men who knew the end had come. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Flashbulbs exploded, but Raven didn't flinch. She stood slowly, turning, not to the cameras, but to the faces in the gallery, faces that had watched, waited, wept. She walked over to Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, who stood to greet her with quiet reverence. Vanessa Holloway offered a soft smile, tears in her eyes, her pen finally still. Maya stood beside Raven with pride radiating from her in waves. A reporter managed to push forward, mic in hand. "Ms. Sinclair, do you have anything to say to the public?" Raven paused, looked straight into the lens, and said, "Accountability is not vengeance. It is the beginning of healing. Today wasn't just a verdict for me, it was a mirror held up to a system that has too often refused to see itself. If you're watching this and wondering what comes next, it's up to all of us." And with that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. Not as the accused, but as a catalyst. As a woman who had stood in silence while the storm gathered, and then made the thunder speak. The gavel may have closed the trial, but Raven Sinclair had opened something far more powerful, the first real crack in a wall that for too long had seemed immovable. Now, with the whole nation watching, change wasn't just coming, it had already begun. Weeks passed, but the ripple effects of the trial had only just begun to settle, and even then the ground beneath Portfield still felt unstable, like something fundamental had shifted. The city, once cloaked in the illusion of order and fairness, now stood raw and exposed under a spotlight it could no longer dim. The Westbridge Police Department announced a full internal overhaul, though many suspected it was more survival tactic than repentance. Several top officials quietly resigned or were reassigned. A federal oversight task force, co-chaired by none other than Raven Sinclair, began auditing departments across the state, targeting those with decades-long patterns of suppressed complaints and manipulated evidence. What had started as a personal battle had ignited a statewide and potentially national reckoning. Raven never returned to anonymity, but she never sought the spotlight either. When national media outlets requested interviews, she gave one, and only one, an unscripted sit-down, where she talked not about her own story, but about the thousands who would never get their day in court. Justice, she said, is not a moment. It's a muscle. If we don't use it, it forgets how to work. The clip went viral, played on every major network, turned into quotes on murals, and printed on t-shirts worn at rallies across the country. Maya remained by her side, now promoted to senior advisor for community engagement. Adrian Calloway received so many calls from potential clients and civil rights organizations that his modest office became a hub for whistleblowers and wronged citizens ready to speak. Vanessa Holloway began a column titled "Bridging the Divide," dedicated to police accountability, and Reverend Elijah Hawthorne spearheaded a city-funded initiative to train young leaders in public advocacy. But it was one quiet moment, weeks later, that defined everything. Raven returned to Alder Street, where it all began. The neighborhood had changed, flowers blooming, sidewalks swept clean, children playing freely. An elderly woman waved from her porch, her eyes brimming with gratitude. On the side of a community center nearby, a mural stretched across the brick wall. Raven's silhouette, standing tall amid fractured badges, surrounded by words painted in bold strokes. Truth doesn't whisper forever. One day it roars. And that roar, Raven knew, had only just begun. In today's world, Raven Sinclair's story is more than fiction, it's a mirror. Her fight against abuse of power and systemic bias reflects the lived experiences of countless individuals who face discrimination, intimidation, or injustice simply for speaking up or asking questions. It reminds us that even those who enforce the law are not above it, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. The most powerful lesson we can take from Raven's journey is this: truth has power, but it needs courage to bring it to light. Whether we're community leaders, students, or everyday citizens, we all have a role in demanding accountability, protecting the vulnerable, and speaking up when we see something wrong. Because change doesn't come from waiting, it comes from standing up, just like Raven did, and refusing to be silenced when it matters most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.